No. Get out. Isn't it somebody wants to hear?
All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpinka, and I'm the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Just to note that this event is being live streamed, so please be aware of the webcam to your right. I'd also like to take this moment to encourage you to silence your phones for the duration of the event. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of The Economy of Sparrows by Trevor Herriot and published by Thistledown Press, and the paperback release of Strangers in the House by Candace Savage, published by Greystone Books. Thank you to Candace and Trevor for being here tonight, as well as acquisitions editor for Thistledown Press, Elizabeth Phillips. I'd also like to thank Jacqueline Morkin and Rilla Friesen from Thistledown for working with us to create this event. I'll now tell you a bit about our first reader. Trevor Herriot is a naturalist, grassland conservationist, and the author of several award-winning books, including Brass Sky Song and the national bestseller, River in a Dry Land, both of which were shortlisted for the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction. Towards a Prairie Atonement, published in October 2016, took 2 Saskatchewan Book Awards. Islands of Grass in 2017, a book of his essays accompanying the photographs of, oh, I'm probably going to say this wrong, Branimir
Jetfire.
Jetbot?
Jetfire.
Okay. It also won 2 Saskatchewan Book Awards and was shortlisted for a High Plains Book Award. He is a recipient of the Kloppenberg Award for Literary Merit and the Saskatchewan Order of Merit. He and his wife Karen live in Regina and spend much of their time on a piece of aspen parkland prairie east of the city. The Economy of Sparrows is his 8th book, but first novel. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and thanks to all of you for coming out and being with us here tonight, tearing yourselves away from another beautiful fall evening. Hasn't it been an amazing autumn? Yeah, so thanks to Alyssa and to McNally Robinson for letting us do this. I want to particularly thank Candace for letting me haul her out to another one of these things. We did this in Regina, and it was a really great night. And I like being with Candace at these kind of events because I think we both are trying in our own way to find those prairie stories from the past that relate to where we are now, and to take a new look at them with new eyes, to take some responsibility for them and start telling some new stories, which I kind of think of as the way I like to write anyway, but Candace has done it very, very well in her books, including this one tonight she's going to be reading from. I want to also thank Thistledown and Liz Phillips, who's here, who is kind enough to take this book on for me, and the Saskatchewan Arts Board for giving me the funding I needed to set some time aside to work on it. Yesterday, I was up at Lac La Ronge, had a nice little event there at the library, and Miriam Corner, who's a terrific writer on her own, and she lives up there at La Ronge, was hosting the event, brought us in, and got to stay at her place and had some moose meat pasta with her. They live a completely different life than us prairie people down here, but it was wonderful to be a part of it, at least for a little bit of time. And then we came back yesterday after having a walk through the woods and into a muskeg, which is very near and dear to Miriam. She's a real defender of the peat moss lands and the muskeg in the north, and is doing a really good job of that. And it was just wonderful to have it come alive, in her hands, and to spend some time there with her. On the drive home, I kept seeing snow buntings fly up from the road and the first red poles of the fall, which surprised me. Little flocks of them, so we know winter is coming. And then I actually saw a great gray owl perched on the edge of a bog, right adjacent to the turnoff to Montreal Lake. That was a real treat. I've been, I think, probably 25 years since I've been up far enough north to really look for one at the right time of year. So that was a wonderful blessing. So tonight I'm going to read from this new book, of course. And again, it's a way to look at old stories from the past, or kind of our histories, our mythologies, the way we think of ourselves as prairie people, settler descended people, and how that continues today in a way, and how we interpret our lives here and find our way forward. So the main character in the book, his name is Nell Rowan. She grew up on a prairie farm south of Indian Head, right where I happen to own some land that we share with some other people. So I'm very familiar with the landscape around Deep Lake, which is where her farm is. And she moved away as a young woman and worked in Ottawa for many years, and then has just recently come back for the last couple of years. But she's found that the whole world has changed around her. All the families and friends that she knew as a young woman are gone. The landscape is completely altered. Farming is so different. And she's struggling with this. But she's also struggling with some of the larger issues that I think a lot of us are today. There are so many complicated social, economic, and environmental issues besetting all of us. And it can be upsetting and lead to some worry and a sense of loss, that the world is changing so fast. Our environment seems to be slipping away. We have all the worry about climate change, and then just nature seeming like it's in retreat. I sometimes think that, a lot of us are feeling kind of a low level of anxiety or grief over these things all the time. And this character certainly is. So it's that kind of a situation for her. I call the book The Economy of Sparrows because it has some fun with the way we've tried to push nature into our human economy. And of course, nature has its own economy that's entirely different and much more circular in a way. But at the beginning of each chapter, I use snippets from an old book by Percy Taverner, who wrote the very first field guide to birds in Canada. And the one for Western Canada is the one I use in each chapter, a little snippet about a sparrow to do with what Taverner called their economic status, because they used the stomach contents research to see what the birds have been eating to determine whether they were a friend or foe of the farmer primarily, or the gardener. Spizella pallida, clay-colored sparrow, characterless in color, economic status. As a weed and insect eater, it must rank close to the chipping sparrow, which it closely resembles in habit, but no detailed study of its food is at present available. Taverner's Birds of Western Canada. After supper, with the sun low over the lake, Nell stood in front of her wall of shelves considering the options. Radio or TV news, music or something to read. Since moving home, it had become an evening ritual, a way to ease herself towards sleep. Lately, the news of coral reefs bleaching and glaciers vanishing had been getting to her. The worse the news, the longer she would need to listen to Garth Brooks or Jennifer Warnes afterwards. 2 weeks ago, she'd made the mistake of watching an episode of Attenborough's Planet Earth. The lack of sea ice had driven thousands of walruses to crowd onto some rocks in Russia, and then hundreds of them climbed to a cliff to get some space, only to fall to their deaths. Nell turned off the TV, darkened the room, and collapsed on the rug, listening through most of Brooks's No Fences CD. After the closing bars of The Thunder Rolls, she stood again. For several minutes, she stared at books lining the floor to ceiling shelves. A person should read something at times like this. It wouldn't have to be profound, but nothing looked appealing. Not the top 2 shelves containing her university English and science textbooks, some bird and plant guides, and a small collection of mysteries by Louise Penny and Alexander McCall Smith. Even less so the other 6 shelves, bright yellow with the spines of National Geographic dating back to the 1960s, except for an 8-year gap marking the period between her father's death and her return to the farm. Tonight, nothing appealed, even music. Every song she liked seemed to be about being alone or sad or brokenhearted. She turned and went to sit on the porch where Lily was watching the land beginning to glow in warm yellow tones. Lily's her border collie. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift with the flat buzzing song of a clay-colored sparrow coming from somewhere behind the house. First one of the spring. It was a bird that always put her in mind of a time when she thought she might be falling in love. It was a clay-colored sparrow that made her invite Etienne on their first date. The Ottawa Rare Bird Alert had reported a clay-colored in the Alvar Prairie at Burnt Lands Provincial Park. She knew the spot, half hour from the city. The thought of a bird from home singing that far out of range was what steeled her courage. Etienne had just begun working as a security guard at the front desk of the museum, and he made a point of stopping Nell on her way out the door after her night shift. She liked the way he said her name, not the sound so much as the way it made his mouth move. You're the lucky one now. You have this grand palace to yourself at night. I have to put up with bossy mums and idiotic couriers all day. In those first encounters, she did little but smile, while Etienne told her bits of his life history. He'd been a museum brat as a boy, fascinated with reptiles. Later on, he'd gone on field trips and fell under the influence of the museum's mycologist. After that, fungi and then lichens became an obsession. In his teen years, when his mother gave him free rein after school and on weekends, he scoured the Ottawa Valley for mushrooms. It gradually became clear there was no father in his life. When he agreed to come to Birdlands Park, Nell wondered if his enthusiasm was interested in her or just a chance to look for mushrooms out of the city. Either way, she was spending her Saturday with a cute Frenchman whose eyes evoked an irresistible clash of poetry and peril. Thanks to a gentleman returning to the parking lot with binoculars in view, the sparrow was easy to locate. It did not sing and merely repeated its soft call note, one fragment of its full buzzing song, but it was enough to take Nell back to patches of rosebush and snowberry and old fence lines. Afterward, Etienne pointed out foliose lichens along the trail, and she pretended to not know how to use a hand lens. The next Saturday, Etienne invited her for a walk along the Rideau Canal, and they took a bus back to his place, where he showed her how to make a spore print. They ate noodles and some kind of sausage, lit cigarettes, and talked about university, why he quit, movies, ethnobotany, acid rain, and Nelson Mandela. He rubbed her feet, and they made love on his couch with too much clothing and not enough grace. Afterward, they held one another long enough to make up for anything that might otherwise have taken away from the beauty of being young and vulnerable in one another's arms. So I'm going to shift ahead a little bit. Yeah, okay, this chapter is called Passerina, which is the genus name for indigo bunting. Indigo bunting, brilliant blue all over, commonly frequents brushy, overgrown wastes. Economic status: in the East, it is credited with doing good work against the brown-tailed moth. To Verner's birds of Western Canada. Nell fell asleep that night thinking of Etienne's hands when he was making a spore print. She stayed asleep until the sun came in her window. Surprised to have made it through the night, she lingered in the sheets and found herself humming an old song her father liked to sing. Always with 3 beers inside him and his cheeks shining. And all this time the wee cock sparrow was chirping away on the shank of the barra. She'd hummed it herself at the museum library and archives through 1,000 nights of wiping the glass cases and wooden cabinets and emptying waste baskets of the men and women who had gone on to postgraduate biology degrees. Stepping into the bathroom, she glanced in the mirror. How different her beauty was back then. The freckles still there, but now they were scattered across a brow and cheeks that had seen a lot of sun. Full lips, glistening hair, smooth skin, the unconscious bloom of health was now as distant as her apartment in Ottawa. She was excited in the first month of her night shifts at the Research and Collections building that she was so excited in the first month that she had trouble focusing. She would get the floors and dusting done in 2 hours and then head to the library. Sometimes she'd allow herself the pleasure of looking through the specimen drawers. They seemed to open themselves. They slid out toward her so effortlessly. The long, wide, and shallow trays of birds spaced evenly against cold metal. As she drew a drawer out into the light, she never knew what to expect. Suddenly, she'd be staring at a tray full of perfectly arranged indigo buntings, their dark cobalt blue shimmering, sending a mixture of awe and dread up her spine. That they were so dazzling, even in death, even bathed in fluorescent light, decades since they'd been taken from the wild, was almost more than she could bear. Something about the birds, cold and dead in those drawers, shook now. The faith that first drew her to birds as a child began to slip away. It was their consistency she found so compelling back then. She could rely on them to return each year on the same dates, and she knew their plumage. The same wing bars, streaks, and rump patches would be there for her to recognize. Nothing else could be counted on in her child's world. The heifers she came to love were shipped off to auction. Her mother gone to the hospital, and then finally one night gone for good. After that, her father couldn't be counted on either. He took his place at the hotel bar next to the other men with tragic stories. Living birds were reliable. The ones in the specimen drawer, not so much. The little differences she saw from one study skin to another, in a string of 10 grosbeaks all belly up and never to be examined on a tray, would sometimes strike Nell with a sudden force. The permanence she thought she knew in nature was a fairy tale. In its place, there was this caricature of death whispering a new truth in her ears. In one of these sessions, as she looked through a drawer full of catbirds, the date and location on a tag made her jump. May 14th, 1892, Deep Lake, Assiniboia. I got to tell you a little bit about this. The book has a historic figure who's not a character in the book, but he's an obsession of Nell's. His name is William Spreadbury. He's an actual bird collector who came out to Western Canada from 1888 onward to almost 1917, I think it was. And he stopped and spent an entire spring in this area south of Indian Head and collected many birds, which are now in the National Museum in Ottawa. Is it? What? The lake, is it deep? Nell was 14. It was a rare day because her father was sober in the afternoon and because they were out in his old Grumman canoe. Oh, not really, he said, just a bit deeper than the other two. Half of it's goof shit. They paddled south from the spit where the pelicans roosted down to the lake's wooded end. So he was here looking for birds? Nell asked. Who? Mr. Spreadborough. Oh, that's what they say. When Nell found the catbird with Deep Lake written on its leg, she pulled the scrapbook out of its hiding place behind a stack of large folio art books in the library. She started a clean page at the back to list the details of any birds she might come across in the collections that were likely from Spreadborough on his trip in the spring and summer of 1892. Over time, as she searched the drawers, she would find some specimen tags with his full name or WS, but if not, and the dates were right, and the location was Deep Lake or Indian Head, she could be certain that he was the collector. As far as Nell could determine, Spreadborough did not have a canoe with him in 1892, but he was a skilled paddler. 4 years earlier, in 1888, his first expedition with the Geological Survey had been entirely by canoe, mapping parts of the Athabasca, North Saskatchewan, and Churchill River Basin. John McCown stayed in Ottawa that summer, but sent his son James to take his place as expedition naturalist. When she saw that Spreadborough had signed on as cook, Nell wondered why he'd left his home in Bracebridge, deep in Ontario's Muskoka country, to join that first expedition. He'd been working in logging camps for several years before that. One night, when she was deep in the McCown Fawns, she found a photocopy of email correspondence 5 years past between one of the archivists and a man named Carver. Carver's grandmother was William Spreadborough's sister, and he had contacted the archivist to find out if the museum archives had any journals written by William. The archivist replied that all they had were a few of Spreadborough's letters and his field notes, which John McCown had used in his catalog of Canadian birds. A second email from Carver included the detail that William had left no surviving children. His first wife and her baby daughter had died in childbirth 2 years before William's first expedition to the Northwest. By the time he signed on, he was living with cousins in Victoria. Nell copied this email and pasted it into her scrapbook, circling a passage near the end. My grandmother often said that of the Spreadborough brothers, William was the nicest. I wonder if he kept any diaries or just his field notes. P.S. I have 4 specimens of his taxidermy work: owl, loon, woodpecker, and one other bird. Another part Nell had circled. Uncle Will was the front man, always heading out in spring for the rest of the party. He would use his own money to set up camp and travel with, as getting an advance from the government was always a delay, but he liked the work, and the McCowns thought that waiting 6 months to get paid was not an issue. As well as collecting and preparing specimens, he was cook and chief storyteller. He had a photographic memory, and thus I presume the lack of known journals. Nell searched the files for Carver's email address, but it had been redacted. One little last bit. One thing that sends the narrative into a new direction is that Nell takes in kids through social services who are wards of the state, takes them out to the farm for a couple of weeks, kind of a respite for the caregivers in the city. And so she's got one of these teenage kids coming this day. The girl, Nell jumped up from the couch. The girl was to arrive at 2. She shut off the radio and headed upstairs to make the bed in the spare room. She cleared out some books and boxes, swept the floor, and placed a towel and face cloth on the bed. Back in the kitchen, she took a second look at the social services file. Carmelita Pinocchio. After the usual terms and instructions came the notes from the girl's social worker. Carmelita is an unusual teen, gifted, extremely bright, compliant. It requires close observation due to persistent delusions, which for the most part seem harmless, receives high grades and praise from her online instructors, switched to distance education after an incident in grade 9, where she was hospitalized for a week with injuries from intervening in a violent altercation at school. Under special needs was the single word, vegetarian. The day she received the file, Nell had phoned Wendy. Protective delusions. What the hell does that mean? Hell if I know. You might want to ask. I wonder if she's indigenous. Pinocchio doesn't sound indigenous. Wendy wasn't sure. Filipino? Spanish maybe? Anyway, I thought you said you asked them not to send you indigenous kids. Yeah, but they can't do that, they said. 90% of the kids are indigenous. Well, what are you worried about anyway? I'm worried because it's grossly underfunded and run by white people working for white governments. I don't want to be part of messing up another generation of indigenous kids. Wendy let out a scoffing laugh. Oh, at least you know you do good things with the kids that come to your place. The rest of us can think we're not responsible and just ignore the suffering out there, but we're in deep denial. You're facing it, you're doing something. Doing something might be trickier with a delusional vegetarian. She checked the fridge. Plenty of eggs from her hens, but she decided to head to town early to get more cheese and lentils and beans. Still lots of carrots and potatoes in the cellar, mostly from Arnie's garden. Her own patch went down the gullets of 3 species of ground squirrel and a pocket gopher. Was this her 4th or 5th kid? Nell had lost the count. Most of the short-term stays so far had been teens who grew up in reserves or small towns, but then found themselves placed in urban foster homes. One 12-year-old who ran away because he didn't like his mother's boyfriends came into the system when he was found tricking on 5th Avenue in the city. Nell always served them good food, showed them how to ride a horse, feed chickens, repair a fence, peel potatoes. And in a few days, most would stop complaining and begin looking Nell in the eye. Most, but not all. So far, only one of them didn't have scars from cutting, and that one, she was told, had attempted suicide twice. The sadness of such things would have scared Nell off, except that she had long ago learned that their dangers could be tamed if you grabbed hold of them and invited them into your kitchen. Her chest ached when she recalled the faces of the children she had hosted, but the experience helped keep her own noonday demons at bay. It was like bird survey work, same conflict and sorrow, but it'd be worse if she gave it up. At 1:30, Nell looked in the mirror, decided a toque might be wise, and headed out the door, Lily at her heel. After the initial home inspection, she insisted on always meeting the social workers at the Shell station on the highway. For some of them, any gravel road was a Raiders of the Lost Ark adventure. The trip into town was unremarkable, but she made a mental note that the marbled godwit was again on territory and making rapid circuits above a hayfield where the creek crossed under the road. After the grocery run to the fine food mark, she wheeled into the gas station lot and drove toward the government vehicle. The girl, a silhouette in the passenger seat, glanced her way. Thank you.
All right, I will introduce our second reader for the evening. Candace Savage is the award-winning author of more than 24 books, including A Geography of Blood, which won the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize for Nonfiction, and Prairie, A Natural History, winner of the Saskatchewan Book of the Year Award. A fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, she was inducted into the honor roll of the Rachel Carson Institute, Chatham College in Pittsburgh in 1994. In 2022, she received both the Cheryl and Henry Kloppenberg Award for Literary Excellence and the Matt Cohen Award in celebration of a writing life. In addition to her work as a writer, she plays accordion in the Saskatoon Fiddle Orchestra, serves as a chair of Wild About Saskatoon and co-chair of the Northeast Whale Watchers, and sits on the National Council of the Writers' Union of Canada. She also edits an online anthology entitled The Singing Land. I will now turn things over to Candace. Please give her a warm welcome.
I wonder. There we go. I think that should work. Thank you so very much for being here. It's a great honor for me to be reading with Trevor, whose Economy of Sparrows I saw at the top of the fiction bestsellers list for McNally Robinson for this period. So that's fantastic. I'm really grateful to Thistledown Press for creating this event with McNally Robinson. I'm also grateful to the Arts Board Saskatchewan Arts Board for support that helped me have time to write this book. Well, as you know, this book isn't entirely new, but this edition of it is in this beautiful, flexible, floppy, wonderful in your hands paperback edition. I got to write a new preface for it because I hated the other one. They made me do it. So I was really grateful for the chance to write something that I liked a lot better. And this edition also has an additional photo. It's quite small, but it's a photo that came out of the wall of our house here in Saskatoon. So the house in question is the house where Keith and I live, on the corner of Albert Avenue and 15th Street in Saskatoon. It's a house that was built in 1929 by Napoléon Sureau de Blondin for his wife, Clara Blondin, and there's then 3 children. I had a hard time deciding what to read to you tonight, but I did start the day writing a letter to the Premier and the Minister of Education entitled, "Trampling on Children's Human Rights is Not a Good Look." And so I've chosen a bit to read to you that in some ways I think is, has some echoes with what's going on around us right now. So in this passage, inconveniently close to the end of the book, there's quite a lot of backstory by this point. We are in 1929, the year that that our house was built. And though I don't know if the Blondins knew it or not, the Premier lived just down the street from them, a man named Dr. J.T.M. Anderson. So I'll read you this bit. We'll see how much backstory I have to fill in. And like Trevor's book, there's little epigraphs for the chapters. This one goes, "Les héritages, c'est comme les chromosomes. Ça se choisit pas. Heritage is like our chromosomes. We don't get to choose." From Jean Fauré in 1983. The long anticipated provincial election was finally held on June 6th, 1929, when the last blazing cross had been extinguished. Backstory needed. J.T.M. Anderson had entered into an unwise, but for him very useful, covert alliance with the Ku Klux Klan in Saskatchewan, which had arrived just a year or two earlier, and built it. The Ku Klux Klan in Saskatchewan at that time built its platform on work that had been done by the Orange Order from the earliest years of settlement in Saskatchewan. inculcating our own particular version of white supremacy in this colony. So when the last blazing cross had been extinguished and the final tally was in, Brother Anderson was pained to discover that his party had yet again been defeated. Although the Conservatives had made impressive gains, up from 4 seats to 24, they had been surpassed by the Liberals. On the plus side, however, Anderson's caucus now included such dignitaries as the Klan's go-to attorney, the Grand Master of the Orange Lodge, representing the Goose Lake district where the Blondins had homesteaded, and J.J. Maloney's father-in-law. Maloney was the spokesperson for the Klan in Saskatchewan. Better yet, the Conservative surge had deprived the Liberals of an outright majority, and when the legislature convened that fall, the ruling party fell on a vote of non-confidence. And that is how it happened that the Blondins' near neighbor, Dr. J.T.M. Anderson, was sworn in as the leader of a coalition government. Saskatchewan's 5th premier continued to insist that he was not now and never had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. But there was no doubt about his standing as an Orangeman. Convinced that the hidden hand of the Pope was interfering in the province's public schools, he threw himself into a program of purification. One of his first moves in his joint role as Minister of Education and Premier was to cut off the supply of French-speaking or bilingual teachers from Quebec on the supposed grounds that their training was deficient. Next, he drafted a law barring religious dress and symbols from all public schools. Never again would a woman wearing a nun's wimple teach impressionable Protestant youth. With those preliminaries out of the way, he then ordered a quick and dirty investigation of the cour primaire, the provision so abhorrent to the Orange Order that permitted 6-year-olds to be taught in French for a single transitional year. The results of this research seemed to confirm Anderson's bleakest fears. Students who were subjected to even these few months of bilingual education were prevented from attaining an adequate grasp of English. Not only did this misguided provision place its victims at a disadvantage, but in Dr. Anderson's professional opinion, and he was had his PhD in pedagogy, in his professional opinion, it put the country's very existence at risk. In remarkably short order, the cour primaire was made ultra vires. All those decades of struggle by the Orangemen and their increasingly unsavory allies had finally borne dismal fruit. Under Anderson's exacting regime, no language other than English was permitted on school playgrounds. No language other than English could be used during the daily half hour of religious training. No language other than English could be spoken in meetings of local school trustees. Although a course in French grammar was still on the books as an option, it was limited to 1 hour per day, and it too had to be taught in English. There was no provision for teaching any other foreign language, no German or Polish, no Ukrainian, and not even a whisper of support for Michif or Soto or Cree. Any school district that failed to observe the English-only rule was deprived of funding. Like their counterparts in Ontario and Manitoba before them, Saskatchewan's Francophone communities were now among the casualties in the country's culture wars. Their sympathizers began to call them les blessés, the wounded ones. There must have been time when Clara Blondin stood at her living room window with her husband away at work and watched as their illustrious neighbors sauntered down the block. Or perhaps she was on the boulevard with her children, knee-deep in the potatoes that she had planted there, and saw him striding past, rushing to a meeting at the Red Robin Cafe on Broadway, or heading homeward. He was an unmistakable figure, a slender, upright gentleman with an arresting gaze and slightly oversized ears, who favored tightly buttoned collars and glistening white waistcoats. Did he acknowledge the Blondin's presence with a stiff nod and a tip of his bowler hat? Did Clara swallow her bruised feelings and smile back? All she and Napoleon had ever wanted to do was fit in and make a good life for themselves. All they had ever wanted was a decent future for their children. Of course, it was unsettling when your most intimate affiliations, your mother tongue, your childhood religion, your ancestry, were disparaged by your own government. But what option did the average person have except to make the best of a bad situation? Clara was not a club woman or a crusader. She was a tiny, fiery being with a grade 4 education who loved to argue and to dance. A few weeks before the provincial election, she'd given birth to another baby, a boy whom they named Charles, and with a family of 5 youngsters to look after, all under the age of 12, she was too busy to concern herself with the wider world. Besides, she was finished with being French. For her, the solution was simple. Just get with the program and speak English. Although Napoleon carried a lingering pride in his ancestry, he expressed it quietly in offhand remarks to his children and through the S in his signature, Napoleon S. Blondin. The guys at work could call him Paul, but in his heart, he would always be N.S. Blondin, Napoléon Sureau de Blondin. That middle initial was a discreet way of giving the finger to Anglo conformity. It was a clandestine gesture of connection with his forebears. But he wanted nothing to do with public squabbles over language and religion. Leave politics to the true believers, to the men of education and standing who spoke for the church and the French community through their lobby group, l'Association catholique franco-canadienne de la Saskatchewan. Let them petition and protest and wrangle. Let them congratulate themselves on winning trivial gains. On the issue of religious garb, for instance, the ACFC had managed to persuade the government that nuns should be permitted to wear their regulation dresses under academic gowns and to replace their wimples with a kind of French widow's bonnet. On all substantive measures, however, Premier Anderson refused to budge, true to the orange watchword of no surrender. Win or lose, orange or bleu, Napoleon would roll with circumstances. His main concern now, as always, was economic survival. He had already accomplished so much through sheer determination and hard work as an entrepreneur, a farmer, a husband and father, a homeowner. He had started out in life with nothing, and now he was a man of means. In addition to putting money into his new house, he had invested some of the proceeds from the sale of his farm near Harris in the stock market, and he had a fat wad of brightly colored certificates to testify to his increasing wealth. That very summer, 1929, the Dow Jones average had shot up by 20%. Say it in English or say it in French, it was all the same to him. He was a self-made man. When the New York stock market crashed late in October, the news flashed around the world. By mid-November, the Dow had lost almost half of its value. But not to worry, the experts said. It was just a natural fluctuation, a correction, they explained, and things would be back to normal before you knew it. Sure enough, stock values did begin to inch up. Meanwhile, on the banks of the South Saskatchewan River, the economy continued to steam ahead. That year, the city of Saskatoon had issued a record $6 million in permits for new construction. In addition to 5 new schools, the community now boasted a magnificent new Eaton's department store, a new power plant and police station, and a fancy new movie house, the Capitol Theatre, with room for 1,600 patrons in its exotic Spanish-themed auditorium. Work had begun on the federal building. McLeod's and Massey Harris had both come to town, and the CNR was preparing to build a luxury hotel, the Besborough, on a prime location beside the river. And so Saskatoon embarked on the 1930s with its bumptious self-regard undimmed. Despite the disturbance in the financial system, the community was continuing to progress. Of a total population that now exceeded 40,000, the vast majority were self-sustaining, with only 50 families on the dole. Although that number had doubled in just 12 months, it was not a reason for concern. As late as midsummer of 1930, the mayor was confidently assuring the public that everything was going to plan. Then, in faraway Liverpool and Chicago, the export market for wheat began to collapse. A bushel of grain that had sold for $1.24 in 1929 was worth just 59 cents by December of the following year. 12 months later, the rate had fallen to 35 cents, the lowest price for a bushel of wheat since the 1600s. Factor in drought and dust storms, factor in grasshopper plagues and debt. When the farmers of Saskatchewan went down, and they went down hard, farm service centers like Saskatoon went down with them. The final blow was delivered by Wall Street. In the spring of 1931, the Dow Jones average, which had rebounded nicely over the previous weeks and months, tipped into a long, slow, steady decline. By the time things bottomed out, the market had dumped 90% of its value, and Napoleon's cache of curlicule-bedecked certificates was essentially worthless. By the autumn of 1932, the number of households on relief in Saskatoon had exploded to almost 1,300, totaling more than 5,000 people in all. Among them were Napoleon and Clara Blondin and their children. Maybe we'll just leave it. Well, I think it's my job to call you back.
Yes, we can sit.
I don't know, it's a long way to the back. So we are hoping that you might want to talk with us.
Otherwise, we're just gonna sit here and perhaps make something up.
We can talk.
Yeah. All comments and questions are welcome. It is fascinating to think that there's something happening with schools right now, that there is a resonance there, isn't there? Of this state manipulation or attempt from politicians to control what's happening in school divisions. So what would happen if a school division today just took a stand and said, no, we're going to do it this way?
Yeah.
Would they have their funding cut, like you were saying, was threatened?
Well, it did actually happen in Saskatchewan in the 30s and 40s. And of course, what we saw there was governments pandering to a particular segment of the population because it's, even though they were embarrassed to do it, in that they at least had the grace to be a bit embarrassed. Yeah. And at that point, there were other political leaders who would at least make an attempt to stand up, you know, and poor old Mr. J.T.M. Anderson did not have a very fortunate political career. He did have the disastrous disadvantage of being elected in 1929, which was, not an auspicious beginning to his political career. So he was booted out at the next election. They were obliterated at the next election.
And that was the Conservative Party.
That was at that point, the Conservative Party. Replaced again by the Liberals. And meanwhile, the poor Blondins lost the House. Yeah.
And I guess we can take a little bit of encouragement because we know things like the Orangemen and the KKK don't have as much sway today as they did then. I mean, I went to school in Saskatoon, to a Catholic school, and we studied French.
Right, yeah. Well,
so something had changed by 1968 anyway, when I was there.
Took a long time.
It does.
It took decades for, so there, you know, a lot of damage can be done that will last a very long time. And the KKK in Saskatchewan, because there had been so much preparation for it by the Orange Order and other organizations with a very clear and narrow definition of who belonged here. The KKK came in with the American showbiz and razzmatazz and the burning crosses and so on, but they did that on top of values. They were able to take advantage of messages that were already here. So they were a very powerful organization. The historians who have looked carefully at the record say that they've had a membership of about 25,000 in Saskatchewan at their height in the late 20s, and they were second only to the grain growers as a public organization. It was amazing, though, apparently afterwards, how few members they had. No one remembered. People were disinclined to remember. Yes.
Did the average person in Saskatoon or Saskatchewan realize that the KKK were here and were influencing things?
Well, they should have, because there was a big cross lit up at one of the churches downtown.
Was there media coverage?
There was media coverage. The machinations I see a head shaking, and so we're going to get to you. Pardon? Yeah.
Right.
Did you? So this person is pointing out that media wasn't the power that it is now in spreading these messages. What spread the message of these organizations really was the churches. So these messages were preached from many pulpits, and that was very. That was one of the ways that these messages were shared and became so normalized.
Wow. Okay, so some of the Protestant churches that people there in Protestant churches may have been hearing about it from the pulpit.
Absolutely, yeah. And whether or not people identified with the KKK, they identified with those messages. Yeah. But there's more in the book. More detail and it was very uncomfortable for politicians to be publicly associated with the KKK because they, one of the first movies to be shown in Saskatoon was The Birth of the Nation. And so the racist message of the KKK was what should have been well known, and there certainly had been scandals in the 20s in the United States. where very similar to today, there were whole slates of governments in state governments were taken over by KKK supporters, but many of them lost power and influence because they were run by really, 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 really bad people who ended up in legal trouble, in case that reminds you of anything. I'm just standing up to be taller than Trevor. And I can't see you at the back everywhere. I want to know, Mr. Herriot, why have you forsaken the fellowship, the fraternity and sorority of narrative nonfiction writers to write one of
I've
those?
had to explain this to Myrna Kostash so many times. She's a great defender of creative, what she thinks is creative nonfiction, and I just gave her a glib answer and said, well, I've been writing literary nonfiction for a while. I thought I'd try some non-literary fiction. That's not a good answer. I just wanted to have a little more freedom, I think, and it was particularly because I was playing with some things that are factual, that are historical, but there was so little that I could actually find on some of these people and their lives. So I felt like I would have to make it up, but also I wanted to connect it more to lives today and what we're all going through as prairie people. Anybody who pays attention to the natural world here and to what's happening with farming and its responsibility and climate change and biodiversity collapse, to show that there's a connection between that and to look at how natural science right from the beginning was roped into the colonial project. And it continues today to, unfortunately, serve those economic aims.
You can do that with nonfiction.
I suppose you can. But I also like the idea that, and again, you can do this with nonfiction, that telling a good story, right? But I felt like I could come up with a better story if I could make some of it up. But I will also admit that I just wanted to have some fun.
Try it out, see if you could do it.
Yeah.
So why is your main character a woman?
Another question, good question I often get because I'm not a woman. But when I talk to people in rural areas who are most frank and open and brave about what they see happening out in the country, it's almost always women. They're very open about it, and they're willing to talk about how it makes them feel, what they've seen. They aren't always willing to take steps as kind of a local activist, because if you step out of line, you will often get, uncomfortable comments from your neighbors. So I was thinking of those people mostly. I just know more women in that world and who are feeling and thinking that way, and it just seemed right. And also there's a narrative that's about mothers and daughters, and the mother-daughter relationship is different than fathers to daughters, for example. And so I wanted to use some of that, especially with this young character that gets in who's lost her mother as well. Yes.
Why do you think that it's mostly women and not men? Why are the men shy?
I don't know. I guess they just feel like they owe something to the men, the male farmers. We're living in a patriarchal world in general, but farming is more, more machismo and more dominated by the male outlook in the world than a lot of other elements. So,
I wonder if it would be different in a ranching community, because so much of ranching is really nursemaid.
yeah.
You're being nursemaid to all those female animals. I
Yeah,
wonder.
that's a good point. Yeah, and it is. Of course, ranchers have a different take on all of this stuff, and they're often the people I'm talking to who are living in rural areas who are upset by what's happening because of the big farmers, not necessarily the smaller farmers or the acreage owners, but the big farmers, and how they have been pulled into this new kind of farming that is really denuding, denaturing the landscape. And ranchers, of course, need to have water on their land. They need to have perennial grasses on the land, and to get that, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yes.
I think maybe Candace's quote of the chromosomes also come in there. Because,
Yeah.
women normally are more in touch with their feelings than men. Sorry, I'm also a man. But it's true, and these issues, it's easier for a woman to speak about it.
Yeah.
Men are fixers by chromosome. Now, we see a problem, you fix it. You don't discuss it, don't think about it, don't make a big fight.
We don't get to choose our chromosomes, or
Yeah.
we don't get to choose our
Women are the
heritage.
ones to discuss it and then do something about it.
Well, good. I'm glad someone's going to fix it all.
Yeah.
That's it. It's good to know it's being looked after.
I haven't a question, but I have a comment as a farm woman. For most all of my life, and one of the things that we do in our small town in the summer is we have coffee twice a week in the mornings at the museum. And for the summer, 2 months. And at 8 o'clock, the farmers come, or 7:30, you gotta be there really early for the men. And when you're serving the coffee, the men are sitting around talking about the machinery. Who's got the best? Who's the testosterone is just fly. The women coming around 9:30, 10, it's a totally different conversation.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
talking about their neighbors and what they're feeling and who's not well and all of the things that are going on within the people.
Yeah. How long would the farming world have lasted without that? Without that nurturing, you know? Yeah, good. That's a great contrast. I'm sure there's a lot of communities experience that same thing.
I remember long ago being part of making a book called A Harvest Yet to Reap, which was a book about settler women and leading into the suffrage movement on the prairies. And one of the comments was that, you know, all the men did was yak, the women made all the fun.
Someone back.
When there is a question asked.
Oh,
you
right.
can't hear it back here.
Right,
I
we should
wonder if they
repeat.
could come forward to use the mic.
Yeah.
They have a
Yeah,
long-
because yours
a
was so
long-
well said. I'm not going to try to repeat it. Why don't we give you a microphone? Say that again. This is a long.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing.
Who is it that can't hear? Oh. I'm a farm woman from a very small town, and in the summer, we have coffee at the museum for a couple of months, twice a week in the mornings. And the men come to the coffee shop. I'm one of the people that sometimes volunteers to serve coffee because we're all volunteers. The men come around 7:38. And the conversation is all around the machinery and how well things are going. And there's a lot of competition about this kind and that kind, and you know, whether it's a John Deere or whether it's a New Holland and blah, blah, blah. And that conversation goes on, and the men leave, and then the women come in about 9:30, 10, and it's a totally different vibe and conversation. Very different. They're talking about their neighbors who's well, who's not well, how things have gone, the gardens, how hard it is this year. It was so dry. Yeah. So there's just such a contrast between, because that kind of led into the question of why a woman is the protagonist in the book.
I think we're getting the hook, Trevor.
We have just a few more minutes, so let's pass this microphone down. Anybody else have any more thoughts or questions? Comments? Yeah.
No, Trevor, I just want to say thank you. I actually don't read novels. This whole section in McNally Robinson in the middle never sees me. I'm always on the outskirts. And sometimes I do, but I really appreciate the way that you grasp that freedom to touch on so many different subjects and issues, which a master like yourself in natural history and nature around us, and you incorporated it in a beautiful novel. I thought that was great. Unfortunately, I had to wait until page 196 to get to my favorite, the house sparrow,
Ah,
And the winner was not very,
you were worried it wasn't gonna show up. I saved the best for last.
no, the winner's little piece on the house sparrow is really not flattering at all.
No.
But where I come from, the house sparrow special meeting, especially this year, I can tell you about that. It was really, I appreciate the way how you incorporated so many relevant issues in this story. It was really great to see. Thank you.
Well, thank you for reading a novel.
It's a sacrifice.
I know. Well, no, it's true. Men tend to read a lot of nonfiction. And I was thinking of women as I was writing the book. My agent once told me that I think it's 70% of readers are women. And women, I know, read more novels than nonfiction.
There we go. So you'll be rich and famous, or
Oh. One or two more questions? Anybody? Thoughts? Well, thank you all for coming out here on this lovely evening and sharing this time with Candace and me. And thank you, Candace and Callie Robinson. The two of us will be here if anybody wants to chat.
yes, and we have to allow.
Here's
to
a
have-
wonderful Elizabeth Phillips.
Hi, I'm not going to take up much of your time. I'm just going to thank Sask Arts, who funds Thistledown Press, and Canada Council for the Arts, and the Government of Canada's Canada Book Fund, and to thank Trevor and Candace for splendid readings and conversations. I love how you interviewed each other and then everybody got in on it.
All right, I'm just going to say a quick word before I let you go. I'd like to thank Candace, Trevor, and Elizabeth for being here tonight. We have copies of The Economy of Sparrows and Strangers in the House on the desk to your right. And if you'd like your copy signed, or if you'd like to say hello, Candace and Trevor will be happy to meet you at the signing table right there. Have a good night. Thank you.